12-step meeting, you should all say, "Hi, Pat."
Hi, Pat.
There you go. You see, I have this compulsion over the years. I've fallen in love with this music, and I keep buying these instruments. A great number of these instruments actually were made here in Canada, and my government back in New York is looking askance at me. The balance of payments is moving in a bad way. And my government, as you may know, can be irrational about these things. So, it's terrible. I come home to my wife and I say, I bought another one, and she says, why is this one? Why is this lute different from all other lutes? And why is it different from the 28 we have in our house already, or the 16 that you have at your studio? I once sat down some 30 years ago with a lute maker who shall go nameless, but his initials are Rainers. And in order to play the entire literature of the lute, we figured out that I would need about 50 lutes. This was some 30 years ago, and it was about $250,000 worth of lutes. I assume there's been considerable inflation since then. Somewhere in the darkness of the Middle Ages, lutes came from the Middle East to Europe. Traders brought them, crusaders, some of the invading armies. The name comes from the Arabic instrument which is called a lute, of wood, which tends to make us believe that at one time there was a kind of an instrument, way in the prehistory of that in the Middle East, that was not made of wood. Perhaps like some folk instruments we still see around the world, it was a gourd with a skin stretched over it. This lute, made by Grant Tomlinson here in Vancouver, one of the insidious band of Canadian lute builders to whom I am unfortunately indebted and about the beginning of the 16th century, many people played small lutes like this, which had 6 pairs of strings. And they had usually 10 or 11 pegs. Sometimes they made the first string a single string. This one's made out of bird's eye maple, which they wouldn't have had, I think, in Europe at that time. It's native of North America, I think. It's pearwood on the back of the neck. Very fine fir, probably from the foothills of the Alps. They're quite bright. That's a tiny, early, 6-course lute. They had at least 3 sizes of lutes that were very common at this time in the early 16th century. One of the greatest families of bankers in Europe, the Fuggers at that time, had a large collection of lutes, and their inventory survives. We know something about the sizes they played. By the way, this is billed as Pat O'Brien and Friends. To parody Al Pacino, say hello to my friend. This is a lute made by Rainers here in Vancouver. You see that Canadian connection there. It has 8 pairs of strings, so it has a similar tuning to the other one, a little bit lower because it's bigger, and a couple of extra low bass notes. In jurisprudence, when you start adding extra bass notes, they would say it's a slippery slope. You'll see what I mean in a moment. There really is no one lute, and each one plays a different literature from a different era. By about 1600, they began to play lutes that had as many as 10 courses like this. That means 10 pairs of strings. Each pair of strings, of course. This one was made by Ken Broadkey in Watsonville, California. Well, it's not a Canadian lute, in fact, but the government of New York City actually looks askance at anything that comes from California. So, that's a nice deep-throated, kind of baritone lute with lots of low bass strings. It's a slippery slope, as I say. some bass strings are good. Are not more bass strings better? Certainly. You can't convince my countrymen, and perhaps a Renaissance person, that more or less is more. Simply more is more. Now, where do you stop? Well, when you have one note for every note of the scale, you've pretty much done it. If you have 8 extra low bass notes, then you think, well, I've got the normal 6 that I started out with over there, plus 8 more, so I have 14. That should be about enough, shouldn't it? Years ago, we made up imaginary instruments that we thought should be included in the great Rose Encyclopedia of Music and Musicians. One of them we thought of finally was called a vermicellophone. It would be sort of like this, but it would have thousands of little tiny strings. So that's an arch lute. This begins to be popular, of course, with this many courses. Where else? In Italy, where my ancestors in Italy would have done pretty well by way of overdoing anything they could do right to the limit. This one is actually made by Robert Lundberg, who was in Portland, Oregon, and passed away some few years ago, and was one of the teachers of a great many people around the States, and taught a workshop in Germany, in the Black Forest area for many years, and trained his own competition throughout Europe. At one point, they weren't satisfied with the way the lute worked, and experimented with many other tunings. One of the great French Baroque lutenists came up with an alternate tuning in which the upper strings actually play a chord. So here we have a Baroque lute. They wouldn't have called it a Baroque lute, they would have called it a French lute and then a Bohemian lute or something like that. This one's made out of holly wood, which looks very white, imitation of ivory perhaps. Holly and ebony. And this one is made by John Butterfield in Portland, Oregon? Seattle. Sorry, Seattle. It has a different tuning. And quite a different sound than the others. These are sort of somewhat more introspective and less commonly used for ensemble playing. They have an elaborate solo literature. This is just another example of a Baroque lute wherein Richard Fletcher of rural Pennsylvania built this some years ago, and he built a kind of Baroque lute on which the basses are longer and more powerful. This we call a swan-necked lute because of the grace of that second neck, which is very complicated to make, in fact. As this one has Velcro on the back, they do slip away from you sometimes. So this has the D minor chord, and then below it, eight notes, which you tune to different combinations of sharps and flats to play in different keys. Once you've tuned them, you don't want to change too often in front of your audience, so you tend to play a group of dances in a row, all in the same key of suite. This one, let's see, has it looks like Brazilian rosewood, which means it's perilous to try and bring it across a border today. This is probably a lighter weight wood that's stained like ebony. It looks black, but it really isn't. And again, the same indispensable spruce top or fir top. That wood has to grow very slowly, so the grain is very close together. It only grows in a few places in the world, and those places are under attack from acid rain now. There will be a limited amount of that wood left in our lifetime. Takes hundreds of years to grow, and it grows right along the snow line, very high in the mountains. So there's my little ecological observation. When they played in theaters and they needed a really extroverted instrument, they came up with this. The lute on steroids. This is called a theorbo. Lutes came in various sizes, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and they took some of the larger bass sizes and added a second neck with many strings on it. They made it as big as possible, made the strings single, so they were thicker. They're not in courses, they're single strings. When they made it big enough, the first string kept breaking, so they tuned it down an octave. They made it still bigger until the second string kept breaking, and they tuned that down an octave. And they have this peculiar combination of very convoluted, we call it re-entrant tuning in the first 6 strings, like this. So in order to arpeggiate the chord, you have to play the strings all out of order. But that's this tuning, sorry. It's kind of a very good accompaniment instrument, makes a lot of sound. It's not primarily made for solos, it's supposed to accompany singers. This is a preferred continuo instrument or accompaniment instrument in the 17th century because it has a capacity that, say, a harpsichord doesn't. It can play bright and very mellow, and it can play loud and soft. It can do a lot of little nuances to fit the accompaniment with each word of the text, to change its affect, as they would have said. So, there you have a family of lutes. We are doing a lute course here. We come to teach this and to study it, and in fact, if you come to teach, you actually bring a very heavy suitcase, because there are an awful lot of kinds of lutes with different tunings. They span roughly, these on stage, from probably 1475. The orbos like this probably were played in the Paris Opera till after the turn of the 19th century. But their heyday is sort of what we call the Renaissance and Baroque eras today, the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. But it's quite an interesting family. So there are my friends. Thank you. Getting kind of desperate here. There are too many good Canadian lute builders. And I don't know, there may be help to pay someone of these days. Meanwhile, I think I've got to go make some more money and buy a few more of these. Perhaps I can hide them in my studio and my wife will know I